The Reproduction of Daily Life, by Fredy Perlman. Part 5, Storage and Accumulation of Human Activity. The transformation of surplus labor into capital is a specific historical form of a more general process, the process of industrialization, the permanent transformation of man's material environment. Certain essential characteristics of this consequence of human activity under capitalism can be grasped by means of a simplified illustration. In an imaginary society, people spend most of their active time producing food and other necessities. Only part of their time is surplus time, in the sense that it is exempted from the production of necessities. This surplus activity may be devoted to the production of food for priests and warriors who do not themselves produce. It may be used to produce goods which are burned for sacred occasions. It may be used up in the performance of ceremonies or gymnastic exercises. In any of these cases, the material conditions of these people are not likely to change from one generation to another, as a result of their daily activities. However, one generation of people of this imaginary society may store their surplus time instead of using it up. For example, they may spend this surplus time winding up springs. The next generation may unwind the energy stored in the springs to perform necessary tasks, or may simply use the energy of the springs to wind new springs. In either case, the stored surplus labor of the earlier generation will provide the new generation with a larger quantity of surplus working time. The new generation may also store this surplus in springs and in other receptacles. In a relatively short period, the labor stored in the springs will exceed the labor time available to any living generation. With the expenditure of relatively little energy, the people of this imaginary society will be able to harness the springs to most of their necessary tasks, and also to the task of winding new springs for coming generations. Most of the living hours which they previously spent producing necessities will now be available for activities which are not dictated by necessity but projected by the imagination. At first glance it seems unlikely that people would devote living hours to the bizarre task of winding springs. It seems just as unlikely, even if they wound the springs, that they would store them for future generations, since the unwinding of the springs might provide, for example, a marvelous spectacle on festive days. However, if people did not dispose of their own lives, if their working activity were not their own, if their practical activity consisted of forced labor, then human activity might well be harnessed to the task of winding springs, the task of storing surplus working time in material receptacles. The historical role of capitalism, a role which was performed by people who accepted the legitimacy of others to dispose of their lives, consisted precisely of storing human activity in material receptacles by means of forced labor. As soon as people submit to the power of money to buy stored labor as well as living activity, as soon as they accept the fictional right of money holders to control and dispose of the stored as well as the living activity of society, they transform money into capital and the owners of money into capitalists. This double alienation, the alienation of living activity in the form of wage labor, and the alienation of the activity of past generations in the form of stored labor means of production, is not a single act which took place sometime in history. The relation between workers and capitalists is not a thing which imposed itself on society at some point in the past, once and for all. At no time did men sign a contract, or even make a verbal agreement, in which they gave up the power over their living activity, and in which they gave up the power over the living activity of all future generations on all parts of the globe. Capital wears the mask of a natural force. It seems as solid as the earth itself. Its movements appear as irreversible as tides. Its crises seem as unavoidable as earthquakes and floods. Even when it is admitted that the power of capital is created by men, this admission may merely be the occasion for the invention of an even more imposing mask, the mask of a man-made force, a Frankenstein monster, whose power inspires more awe than that of any natural force. However, capital is neither a natural force nor a man-made monster which was created sometime in the past and which dominated human life ever since. The power of capital does not reside in money, since money is a social convention which has no more power than men are willing to grant it. When men refuse to sell their labor, money cannot perform even the simplest tasks, because money does not work. Nor does the power of capital reside in the material receptacles in which the labor of past generations is stored. since the potential energy stored in these receptacles can be liberated by the activity of living people whether or not the receptacles are capital, namely alien, property. Without living activity, the collection of objects which constitute society's capital would merely be a scattered heap of assorted artifacts with no life of their own, and the owners of capital would merely be a scattered assortment of uncommonly uncreative people by training who surround themselves with bits of paper in a vain attempt to resuscitate memories of past grandeur. The only power of capital resides in the daily activities of living people. This power consists of the disposition of people to sell their daily activities in exchange for money, and to give up control over the products of their own activity and of the activity of earlier generations. As soon as a person sells his labor to a capitalist and accepts only a part of his product as payment for that labor, he creates conditions for the purchase and exploitation of other people. No man would willingly give his arm or his child in exchange for money. Yet when a man deliberately and consciously sells his working life in order to acquire the necessities for life, he not only reproduces the conditions which continue to make the sale of his life a necessity for its preservation, he also creates conditions which make the sale of life a necessity for other people. Later generations may of course refuse to sell their working lives for the same reason that he refused to sell his arm. However, each failure to refuse alienated and forced labor enlarges the stock of stored labor with which capital can buy working lives. In order to transform surplus labor into capital, the capitalist has to find a way to store it in material receptacles, in new means of production, and he must hire new laborers to activate the new means of production. In other words, he must enlarge his enterprise, or start a new enterprise in a different branch of production. This presupposes or requires the existence of materials that can be shaped into new saleable commodities, the existence of buyers of the new products, and the existence of people who are poor enough to be willing to sell their labor. These requirements are themselves created by capitalist activity, and capitalists recognize no limits or obstacles to their activity. The democracy of capital demands absolute freedom. Imperialism is not merely the last stage of capitalism, it is also the first. Anything which can be transformed into a marketable good is grist for capital's mill, whether it lies on the capitalist's land or on the neighbor's, whether it lies above ground or under, boats on the sea or crawls on its floor, whether it is confined to other continents or other planets. All of humanity's explorations of nature, from alchemy to physics, are mobilized to search for new materials in which to store labor, to find new objects that someone can be taught to buy. Buyers for old and new products are created by any and all available means, and new means are constantly discovered. Open markets and open doors are established by force and fraud. If people lack the means to buy the capitalists' products, they are hired by capitalists and are paid for producing the goods they wish to buy. If local craftsmen already produce what the capitalists have to sell, the craftsmen are ruined or bought out. If laws or traditions ban the use of certain products, the laws and the traditions are destroyed. If people lack the objects on which to use the capitalists' products, they are taught to buy these objects. If people run out of physical or biological wants, then capitalists satisfy their spiritual wants and hire psychologists to create them. If people are so satiated with the products of capitalists that they can no longer use new objects, they are taught to buy objects and spectacles which have no use but can simply be observed and admired. Poor people are found in pre-agrarian and agrarian societies on every continent. If they are not poor enough to be willing to sell their labor when the capitalists arrive, they are impoverished by the activities of the capitalists themselves. The lands of hunters gradually become the private property of owners, who use state violence to restrict the hunters to reservations, which do not contain enough food to keep them alive. The tools of peasants gradually become available only from the same merchant who generously lends them the money with which to buy the tools, until the peasants' debts are so large that they are forced to sell land which neither they nor any of their ancestors had ever bought. The buyers of craftsmen's products gradually become reduced to the merchants who market the products, until the day comes when a merchant decides to house his craftsmen under the same roof, and provides them with the instruments which will enable all of them to concentrate their activity on the production of the most profitable items. Independent as well as dependent hunters, peasants and craftsmen, free men as well as slaves, are transformed into hired laborers. Those who previously disposed of their own lives in the face of harsh material conditions cease to dispose of their own lives precisely when they take up the task of modifying their material conditions. Those who were previously conscious creators of their own meager existence become unconscious victims of their own activity even while abolishing the meagerness of their existence. Men who were much but had little now have much but are little. The production of new commodities, the opening of new markets, the creation of new workers, are not three separate activities, they are three aspects of the same activity. A new labor force is created precisely in order to produce the new commodities. The wages received by these laborers are themselves the new market. Their unpaid labor is the source of new expansion. Neither natural nor cultural barriers halt the spread of capital. The transformation of people's daily activity into alienated labor, the transformation of their surplus labor into the private property of capitalists. However, capital is not a natural force. It is a set of activities performed by people every day. It is a form of daily life. Its continued existence and expansion presuppose only one essential condition: the disposition of people to continue to alienate their working lives and thus reproduce the capitalist form of daily life.